Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, the politics, and the policies that drive Texas. I'm Brian Phillips, Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and one of your hosts for The Right Idea, with my co-host, Derek Cohen, who runs our policy shop, our Vice President of Policy for Texas Public Policy Foundation. How are things going this week, Derek?
Busy. I think we're finally starting to be able to say that we are in session now. Not only do we have the appropriation subs, which we'll talk about, but we're actually starting to see postings with actual bills.
Actual bills. It would be remiss if I didn't ask you. This week was Mardi Gras. Are you a big Mardi Gras guy? On Tuesday, did you go out and celebrate Fat Tuesday or get ready for Lent or?
No, unfortunately not. My celebration of Fat Tuesday was essentially, I think I had a beer and then maybe watched a little bit of TV and then went to bed. Actually, fairly early, so maybe that is celebrating in a way.
I went to the University of Texas. We're only about 7 or 8 hours from New Orleans, so we definitely did that during college. So I got all I needed from the New Orleans Mardi Gras. But I don't think either one of us are Catholic and follow us. But a lot of people still try to use this time to give up something or to sacrifice something. And are you giving up sweets or?
Well, as I mentioned, I've given up sleep.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, there for the session. A lot of people try to give up alcohol, but it is session. So maybe
let's be real here, man.
A session can get deep, and maybe you might need a glass of wine or two towards the end of session. All right. So let's do a little bit of housekeeping first. If you'd like to give us feedback, we love getting your recommendations for stories and things like that. I'm on Twitter at RealBphil, and Derek is on Twitter at Cohen@TPPF. So we'd love to get your feedback. Love to get your constructive criticisms and all of that as well. A couple other things. We have a great weekly newsletter that goes out that is really kind of encapsulates all the things that are going on at TPPF, but also our takes on all the various issues of the day. A lot of stuff that we don't cover here on the podcast. You can sign up for that newsletter at texaspolicy.com/thepost. texaspolicy.com/thepost. Also, next week, huge week for TPPF. It is the annual policy conference that we have that we call Texas Policy Summit. You can find out a ton of information about who all has been invited, all of the keynote speakers at texaspolicysummit.com. We have I think for the first time ever in the 20-year history of doing our policy summit, we have the big three are going to all be in attendance. So Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor, and the speaker will all be there, as well as a ton of members and experts talking about all the issues that matter to Texas. Again, that's texaspolicysummit.com if you would like to attend that or watch online. We're going to be live streaming all of the speeches and all of the various panels and things as well. So, all right, today we're going to get right to it. Later in the program, we're going to go in depth on probably one of the top 3 national issues. If the economy is number 1 and immigration is number 2, certainly public safety is number 3. And of course, Derek ran our Right on Crime program for a long time, so he's probably got some ideas, some thoughts and opinions on public safety we want to kind of get to. In top topics, we have the president. If he would have just not reversed all of the immigration success that we'd had at the border, he may be in a much better shape. But he has reversed a reversal of the Trump administration. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the border, and then get into some election reform that's going on here in Texas. That's an issue we haven't hit very much, and so I definitely want to hit that. But first, before we get to all of that, we, of course, have Derek Cohen giving us our Lege-Land update. What's going on up at the Capitol?
Well, as I mentioned, we have the appropriations subcommittees meeting now. So this is on the House side. All the members of the Appropriations Committee are doled out to these various subcommittees that deal with the different articles of the budget, usually, germane to some of their experience. You'll have Article 3 education, you'll have the public safety articles, which are 4 and 5, and then it kind of gets all over the place. One being the general government, which has many of the agencies, 2 being healthcare. So needless to say, a lot of these have been meeting already, and so we've heard a lot of these agencies give their testimony already in the Senate and Senate Finance. But it's interesting to see a House perspective on some of these things. So that's going to be an arduous process. It's going to continue going, just as they really get into the nitty gritty of the actual budget. Big big news last week. We recorded this on Thursday morning before going to the State of the State, where we saw, 7 items. And luckily, I'm not one for prognostication, but we were largely accurate with what we discussed.
The governor's emergency items.
Absolutely. And so, I mentioned that we're actually seeing hearings posting with bills. One of the things that he mentioned, was property taxes. So I think we're going to finally be able to see some early movement on those as well. And, we've talked about kind of the competing ideas on there. And while there are several bills that do good in different ways. It'll be very helpful to see both in the Senate and in the House what the chamber's approach to this particular policy quandary is going to be.
So we have, it was things like school, parent empowerment. We have property tax cuts. School safety was a big one as well. Energy, of course, making sure the grid is still stable. Were there any surprises on there that you thought?
Actually, yeah, I thought the ending COVID restrictions was a bit of a surprise. Not that it's surprising in that it's not an issue and doesn't need to be done, because you and I have discussed the problem with the emergency declarations. As we have to do for various government processes to take place. The problem, of course, is the parade of horribles that enables. Elsewhere in statute.
Business shutdowns, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Or even worse, you're delegating the power to do those things to the petty tyrants at the local level. And I mean, not to besmirch various county judges, but I think that's where we saw most of the abuses of COVID happening. But yeah, so that kind of surprised me.
I think I'm surprised just because I think Texas did a pretty good job in terms of relieving the lockdowns and getting our economies back going and getting kids back in schools and things like that. So I think a lot of people might even be shocked that this is still an issue that needs to be not only addressed but needs to be addressed in an at an emergency level. It needs to be addressed now. So what exactly are they going to be working on in terms of lifting those restrictions?
I don't so much think it's going to be the end or. I mean, it pretty much is, but I don't believe it's going to be, well, we're just going to stop the continuance of these particular declarations. I think and again, I don't wish to speak for the governor, but what I divined from the tea leaves is that he meant basically addressing some of the structural setup around those. He mentioned during the State of the State that after a certain amount of time, calling the legislature back in and having a trigger for that. And I think that's a really good idea because if something is an actual emergency, like something, the state is, maybe quite literally on fire. In that case, the legislature might not be able to convene, but after 30 days, why not? If there's going to need to start making laws or addressing or appropriating, most likely, money to go after and mitigate a particular disaster, then they need to be in session. Doing it through agency or doing it through the local government fiat just is not a sustainable solution, nor is it compatible with the way we structure our government.
I think the one thing that it really, one thing that helps is public knowledge about what it is that the agencies or the governor or other members of the legislature actually see are the problem. I think the most frustrating thing was, we understand there's a pandemic going on, we understand there's a public health crisis, and that we may need to take some measures in order to protect the public, but be open and transparent about what those things are. And if the governor or the mayors or the county judges or whoever can just unilaterally decide with the stroke of a pen without ever, having to explain themselves why they're furthering the lockdowns or why they're furthering the restrictions, I think that really is what drove a lot of frustration. And so if you have the legislature is required then to come back in, you at least will have some kind of debate. You'll have some kind of public discussion about here are the statistics, here are the things that we're seeing, right?
Well, let me yes and that because I think that you hit on a really, really good point. We complain to no end about how Congress is basically, while they're physically in D.C., they don't want to do their job anymore. And I can say that collectively. Congress has abdicated institutionally so much of its responsibility to executive agencies that I know the irony is we were just through a president who's very unpopular on the left. And now we have one who's very unpopular on the right. Yet we still can't get to that issue or get to that understanding like, wow, with these radical changes in administration priority, why are we wanting the executive agencies to have this large portfolio of authority and power? And, like we have the memories of a gnat apparently. But one thing I will say is, even though Congress does
Or
that,
schizophrenic, one of them.
like porque no los dos.
Yeah.
For this particular thing, this is something that the legislature here in Texas was frothing at the mouth to address. Like, they wanted to, basically assert their supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And most American, when I say American, I mean both at the federal level and at most states, have the legislature as the supreme actor in the constitutional order. Mm-hmm. Here is no different. Here they actually want to assert their authority. So mm-hmm. I think that rather than, the secretary shall, the governor shall, so on mm-hmm. and so forth, here we have a legislature that says, nope, the legislature will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so that makes a lot of sense then. I just think for a lot of people, it's like, you walk outside, you go to your store, nobody's wearing masks. Like, it's, people don't feel like we have any of the restrictions. Mm-hmm. So it was a little head scratching, but it makes mm-hmm. a lot of sense now, particularly mm-hmm. for
Absolutely.
How we will deal with these things in the future, not necessarily right now, but if there's some other kind of public emergency, how we will deal with those things in the future. Okay. All right. Anything else in the legislature we need to hit?
No, just, we're on that T-minus countdown now. Just get ready to get blasted into space, it seems like.
96 days, 95, how are we, 97 days away?
I think 96, if I recall correctly, recording on a Thursday.
So, yeah, before Sinai die. Although, who knows?
But who's counting?
Yeah, there are going to be some really big, tough issues to get through that don't necessarily line up right versus left, that aren't going to be, obvious partisan, majority versus minority. So I think there will, there'll be some very active legislative business towards right up until the gun goes off. All right, so let's get to a couple of topics. And I want to pick a couple of things that we don't always talk about, although border security is still the number one issue in the country right now. It's certainly the number one issue in Texas and has been for a long, long time. 2 days ago, President Joe Biden, and I'll just read from the article, President Joe Biden essentially went back to a Trump-era rule on the border, which would require anyone who is seeking asylum to first ask for asylum in a country that they've traveled through. So basically, this would apply to everybody coming up from Central America who is going through Mexico, that at some point, in order to even be eligible to apply for asylum in the United States, they would have to ask for humanitarian asylum in Mexico first and then be denied. Mm-hmm. During the Trump administration, this was one of 2 or 3 or 4 really big reforms or really big initiatives that stem the tide, that for the first time we were getting control of the border because we had these rules in place that wouldn't just allow people to walk across the border, be detained by authorities, ask for asylum, and then be released into the United States for some asylum hearing years later. Of course, they, half or 2/3 of them don't ever show up. This was a rule that was put in place that really started to stem the tide in terms of people coming here or encouraging people to come here and abuse our asylum system. On the day after the president was inaugurated, or within several days of the president being inaugurated, he reversed that. And of course, that's what opened up the floodgates again. And now he is trying to take credit for the mea culpa and reversing his reversal of that policy. What's your? I mean, you could go a lot of different ways on this. I mean, obviously it's good policy, but or you could just go cynical, like, why the hell didn't you do it? Did you do this in the first place? Thoughts and takes on the politics and policy of the border?
Well, absolutely. To avoid such cynicism, I'll say, like 1/4 of an eighth of a cheer for
have an attaboy, just to add it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll give him the A. But no, I mean it's an internally consistent policy. I mean, obviously, it's not even putting your finger in the hole in the dam, because this is like just poking the water and hoping it doesn't go anywhere. But it is at least an internally consistent policy insofar as it, the folks seeking asylum, are leaving country X for whatever reason, right? And so in doing so, they have to travel across 3-4 other countries, that of which they are not being persecuted, or the what qualified them for asylum under the current system would be triggered. So it makes perfect sense there. It's like they need to be safe immediately. Well, they're safe immediately through Mexico and the countries to the south of there in Central America. Why does it need to keep coming up, through to this unmitigated disaster that's at our border? And so, yeah, like I said, I'd give it faint praise. I mean, not naturally having to reinstate this was his own doing. One thing I will add, though, and then because this is a good lesson for policymaking generally, one thing I would add is sometimes the best solution is doing absolutely nothing.
Right.
And I think that had Biden, at least on the questions of the border, came in and just did nothing, we'd still have problems with the system that we have, but a lot of those ancillary policies that kind of staunched the flow would have remained in place, and we could have dealt with a much more manageable crisis than what we're dealing with currently.
There was such a push in this administration to be everything anti-Trump.
Yes.
And certainly the issue of the border, which was probably the top issue for the president during his presidency, that you could demonstrate that you were anti-Trump in no bigger way than to go directly at his border policies. And of course, unfortunately, the border policies were working. They were actually holding the border. This is now the second time that the president has reversed his reversal. He came out very strong against Title 42. I'm sure most listeners and watchers understand what Title 42 is. That's been in a big debate over whether or not that's even good policy, but at least it was working for a while.
Yes.
But that was the second time is that he came out, and now they were supportive at the end of last year of keeping Title 42 and actually argued in court for keeping Title 42. And so, yes, I think it's easy to be cynical. I think it's just sad, honestly. I just think it's very disappointing because of the crisis that's occurred at the border and the rush to be, everything anti-Trump. And there's certainly other examples of that, whether it's energy and when we were energy independent, of course.
Criminal justice and public safety.
Criminal justice, public safety, the Second Step Act, or First Step Act. Sorry, we're not quite to the second step. First Step Act. A lot of those things, in his rush to be anti-Trump, that reversed good policies. So very frustrating. I'm sure for the border communities that this is welcome, but probably a little bit too late.
Absolutely.
All right. So another issue that we want to get into is election oversight. I mean, we just had, last session where I guess we're all a little exasperated because election integrity reform was such a big issue in the last session. And it felt like, everybody was pulling for, 2, 3, extra legislative sessions.
Because that's what happened.
Special sessions. Yeah, we didn't feel like it. We were doing it. And so, but we got it across the line. Like the conservatives got really good reforms across the line. And so it felt like they had really addressed a lot of the issues. But then the election happens, and then you have all of the problems that happened in Harris County, and you have all of the reactions from officials in Harris County that expose that still a lot needs to be done. One of those things is a legislation reform that has been proposed in the Senate by Senator Brian Hughes, Senator Paul Betancourt, that would give more recourse for folks who feel like there have been election irregularities during the election, but they're hitting a wall because most of the time the county gets to determine whether or not investigations happen. So lay out and get your thoughts on this. This would allow election judges, candidates, county chairs of political parties, people who oversee the elections and have a real stake in the outcomes of the elections, not just voters, but folks who work on this all the time, would be able to petition or be able to ask questions of the county election officials, and they would expect to get in a reasonable amount of time answers. They can go through this process twice, and under this legislation, if they're still not satisfied, if the answers still have not come, there would be additional recourse where they could then go and petition the Secretary of State. What do you make of this legislation?
I mean, it makes sense. It's a standard deconfliction process because you have an issue here where you don't need to look too far to see why the current system raises a lot of questions. For example, we're going to talk about public safety later. One of the things that I hear on the left all the time is, well, we can't trust the police to, police themselves. And, from a incentive standpoint, I get that. Now that's, then their solutions are obviously crazy then. But from an incentive point, that makes sense. But how is that rationale any different than a, judges, county officials, folks who actually may have benefited from a problem, if there was one, to take a scrutinous, sober-eyed view of looking into it. It does not line up incentive-wise. Now, what I like about this particular approach, it also doesn't ratchet everything up all the way to 11, saying, this guy sneezed on me in line at a polling place, and therefore I got out of line, and my vote was called. You know what I mean? And rockets that to the Supreme Court or something, something like that. But that being said,
not being sneezed on should be a human right, though. Yeah,
I was
just gross. But yeah, go ahead.
No, look, I'm not pro sneeze. Lest anybody hear otherwise. I'm not pro line sneezing.
Just say it. It was your analogy. You brought it up.
But all that to say is, it takes a measured view of what might be asymmetric incentives and offers a pathway to get those remediated by folks who don't benefit from a problem should it exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And even though this doesn't necessarily let any voter bring a case or ask questions, it's still, like you said. I mean, it alleviates if you think the problem is the way that the county is administering the elections. I mean, we saw all
or in Harris County's case, not.
Yeah, right. I mean, they didn't even have enough paper. Like, how does that happen? And you start asking questions like, how do we, first we have to figure out what the problem was in order to fix it. But if they're stonewalling and they're not taking any, responsibility for it, prior to this legislation, that would be it. There's that you wouldn't have any recourse to try and figure out how to make the election run smoother. You're not even talking about, fraud at this point. You're just simply saying, like, when I show up, are we going to actually have paper ballots to actually vote? So this does give more recourse. It puts a lot more, I think, responsibility and more on the plate of the Secretary of State, which may or may not be a good thing for her. But at the same time, this at least feels like you're not going to hit a log jam. You're not going to hit a wall. Asking the people who have an interest in not fixing the system to try and fix the system. Another piece of legislation that I know that you know a lot about and we're pretty supportive of is SB 2. I think that was released this week, restoring a higher illegal voting penalty, restoring that to a penalty. Felony.
I would say we can put those together. A penalty is
penalty. That's like when I go a lot of different directions there. So it'll restore it to a felony. Take us through kind of the backstory of this, because some people may not even know that this.
Yeah, and I know this might sound a little inside baseball-y, but as you remember, we had a offense for illegal ballot harvesting that pre-existed the election reform from last year. One person, I believe her name was Crystal Mason, got caught up in that for something that was, largely a mistake. Now, there are two ways, and when addressing criminal law, there's two ways of tightening it up. One, you can change the scienter or mens rea requirement, basically saying what was the threshold of the guilty state of mind in order to have committed that offense. And another way is you can just make the punishment sting more or less. And so usually you do one or the other when trying to do these fine adjustments. They did both last year. They both put a strong mens rea component. I believe it was knowingly, so you have to knowingly have committed the crime. But then they have also dropped that down to a Class A misdemeanor. So it kind of took the wind out of the sails of that particular criminal offense twofold. So what they're going back, and now again, going back the other way, the same things are on the table, and they've chosen to restore the penalty, which is good because you don't want to start making strict liability crimes where, you've done it. So, I mean, even if it's through no knowledge of your own, you're still guilty of it. So it's very hard to start tweaking criminal laws in terms of that mens rea requirement. But in doing so here, by just increasing the penalty, says, look, okay, we're still going to say if you've knowingly done this, you're guilty. But you're going to have that stiffer penalty on the other side. So that makes perfect sense.
Again, yeah, it makes good logic. I mean, if there are accidents that happen, there are people who unknowingly, vote in the wrong place or don't change their address or something like that, and there are accidents that happen. So it makes sense that we would strengthen it or limit it to people who are going after the people who are actually trying to defraud the elections, people who are trying to find these loopholes in our rules in order to get people who shouldn't vote into the ballot box or get people to vote multiple times.
And if I may, if you look at both the Mason case and others, these cases don't turn on the interpretation of the mens rea component. It's basically because it's really hard to claim, oh, well, I accidentally ballot harvested because I had thousands in my car with all these different names of dead people on it or whatever the case might be. Those are the typical cases. So, but you still want to have that strong mens rea component, so that you're getting the right. You're getting those people. You're not getting the Crystal Masons.
Well, and then there was the story of the guy who was just stealing mail. Like he was looking for Social Security checks or whatever, and they found like 300 ballots in the back of his car. I mean, obviously he's doing like the awful thing. I mean, that wasn't an accident. They probably should throw all kinds of books at that guy. And then, I mean, at least put the ballots back, maybe. Like have some pride, about American democracy. All right, so with the time that we have left, about 10 minutes or so, I do want to get into the issue of public safety, and there's not, that's not like a legislative issue, like border security or the inflation of the economy. It's a very general issue, and people's ideas of public safety can vary. But I did want to hit it because it always comes up. I mean, it always comes up, not just in the polling and the public opinion surveys, which we do a lot of, but it's everywhere on the news. I mean, obviously, if it bleeds, it leads, and if it's local, the news are going to cover it. In Austin, I mean, it made national news. The video of the drag racing that was going on, the lawlessness.
That's what I did for Mardi Gras.
I was noticing that you had some burn on your tires. I was like, are you just mudding or what are you doing?
I live life a quarter mile at a time.
In your Buick. But anyway, it's obviously a very serious issue, a public safety issue, and of course that you have the video, the awful videos of the crowds pushing the cops back and in the vehicles and all of that. But that's just one limited example of what it seems like almost every day, whether it's Fox News or other outlets that are finding these things and pushing them out there and trying to demonstrate that there is a rise in crime under Biden. Is it defunding the cops? I mean, is it, that's one of the things that you hear, of course, is that, a lot of cities defunded cops after the riots and the social discontent, I guess, of 2020. There's a lot of changes that happened in places in Texas, but certainly all around the country. Is it defunding the cops? Is it, do you think, having someone who's studied these issues for a long time, is it deeper and more than that?
It's definitely deeper and more than that. I mean, obviously, with some of the legislation that passed last session, defunding the cops, Harris County's finding out the hard way, or defunding law enforcement is, it comes with a very severe penalty, administratively speaking. But that's really not what's to blame here. Now, you also have to keep in mind, it's not like there was this long-standing campaign against street racing in the state of Texas. Now, there has been certain hyper-local applications. I know Harris County, Houston, has had problems with groups like this, for a while.
Yeah,
for a while.
I was in high school in here. Right?
I was going to say, yeah. I'm trying to rack my brain to think about how many sessions I've heard. A member of the Harris County delegation lay out something, and me hearing about this and, not having grown up in Houston, I'm completely taken aback by it. But that being said, so yeah, it came to Austin. So the fact that it emerged or that it happened really isn't the issue. The issue is you had the very, very long 911 wait times. You had the one officer on the scene or the one car on the scene get, driven back. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't much that he could have done, but getting more officers on the scene. And here's where I think you're starting to see problems, is because one of the issues that the Austin police reform community has brought up, and they are, they're folks who I believe are well-meaning, but their ideas are. I think I can characterize them accurately using their own words by calling them abolitionist. Mm. But that being said, they address things such as use of force standards. Austin has one of the best use of force standards in the state, because they know how much attention is paid to this. But even moving further away from less than lethal force, they've taken a lot of options off the table for dispersal of crowds and things like that. Now, again, when you only have one officer on the scene, him trying to disperse a crowd, the math doesn't work out there.
The word that left you, it feels like they use all the time, is de-escalation.
Right.
Like, don't escalate the situation.
How and to the point, to use this example, I would say, how would you de-escalate that situation where people are running over, fires and catching their trucks on fire and stuff like that, and just absolute. I've seen people say chaos and anarchy,
right, sure.
but like I don't have a better word to describe it, because that's the core function of what the police should be doing. And when you tie 9 fingers behind their back, you wonder why you get this kind of outcome, or what seems like a ineffectual response, when truth is they probably played every card in the hand.
When we look at public opinion on this, and we've tried to understand exactly how the public, the majority of the public in Texas and places around the country feel about this. What we get is, particularly at heightened times of crime, what you get is this outpouring of just make it stop, right? Like, just be very forceful and go out and go get the criminals and put them behind bars and and protect the public from the threats that are out there. But at the same time, and I don't think this is schizophrenic, I think this actually is fairly reasonable, is at the same time they realize that not everybody is a mass murderer that needs to be put away for the rest of their life, or some horrible child rapist or something. The vast majority of criminals are people who we all would think do not deserve to spend the rest of their life in jail. And so you have this kind of two-prong approach that the public wants to see. And I want to get I don't know if there's a magic unicorn policy that fits all of this, but I'll just kind of lay it out as what the public wants to see. They know who the major threats are, and they know that those people should be behind bars probably for the rest of their life, or at least for a long, long time, until they've fully rehabilitated. And so there needs to be an element of crime prevention, right? And so to put those people behind bars, but then also there needs to be enough cops on the streets to feel like I can walk around without being mugged or what have you. The other side of that is, once someone commits a crime, there needs to be some kind of program, or I'm just using this language, I don't know exactly what it is, but some kind of effort to make sure that person understands, not only do they not only is there justice, they serve their time, but that there's some kind of effort to maybe help's not the right the right word, but some kind of initiative to rehabilitate people, to say understand that what you did was wrong, and understand the reasons why you were putting yourself in that position. Maybe it's lack of social services, a lack of a lack of education, family services, all kinds of reasons. Maybe there's drug and alcohol abuse, or there's mental health issues, things like that. The public does want some effort in that direction. Yes. It's not like we just put everybody who ever committed a crime behind bars. And so is there a public policy, a magic wand that you can wave, where the system can differentiate between the major threats who should probably spend the rest of their life in jail, throw the book at them, yes, check that box, we're done, but then there's some kind of effort on the part of our officials in the system to make sure that folks are, coming out, being rehabilitated, and then have opportunities to not get back into that life.
Wow, that's like a fourfold.
Yeah,
question.
I know. It's but that's really the public policy problem.
Right. No, and very very rarely on this show do I get to mention some of my academic work. So allow me to shout out one of the first papers that I did, Rehabilitation in a Red State, 2014, Criminology and Public Policy. There we go. No, but me and my co-authors looked at that exact phenomenon that you brought up, because we did a poll in Texas about some of the work that went through in 2007, which was, for those of you who don't know, again, without belaboring the point, in 2007, Texas took a long, hard look at the way the entire prison system was structured, went ahead and made fairly modest changes, to be honest with you, but ended up just redounding to the sense of public safety, of correctional expenditures, so on and so forth. That being said, is the public sentiment still with you? And what we found, and this is very interesting, and this was if I had to say, this was the contribution of this paper to the field, was that it essentially illustrated that the ideas of rehabilitation and punishment are not in conflict. Essentially, that people want to punish. Like, people do feel a moral feel moral opprobrium towards law breaking, and they want that person to suffer for that. But they also want them to successfully and as soon as safely possible rejoin the community as a productive citizen. And I think that's a good shorthand for how we describe criminal justice in general. Now, a lot of people just want to do the rehabilitation side, the more hug-a-thug types. And obviously, not every rehabilitation program fits every offender typology or pathology. It's, we just need to have the flexibility to do that. Now, to your actual question, what about the policy? The policy that we need, and I'm going to punt to actually an article, or should I say work in criminology that came out a couple years prior to, going all the way back to Jeremy Bentham in England. Essentially, punishment needs to be swift. It needs to happen proximate in time to the incident happening. It needs to be certain. There needs to be knowledge that it's going to happen, and it needs to be commensurate with what the actual offense was. And if any one of those three are out of balance, you're not going to have the detrimental or even rehabilitative effect that you're looking for in that system. So, that being said, what's one policy that can? Well, you heard the governor say this. You heard the lieutenant governor say this. You've heard members of the House in the various areas say this. We need to get these prosecutors under control. And that's not, and I hasten to add, when we're talking about prosecutors have completely abandoned the field of law, not even of law and order, but just rule of law,
right,
we're talking about the number that you could count easily on two hands. You don't necessarily need to, find who the Erath County prosecutor is and find out why he's not prosecuting murder or drug charge.
Right.
But what we're seeing is the major counties mostly have these programs where they essentially just do not prosecute as practice certain broad categories of crime without individual review on the individual case. Right. That is completely against the law. Now, we'll tell you, here at Right on Crime, we've supported these diversion programs. And a diversion program is, say, where a prosecutor requires somebody charged with, say, possession of marijuana or whatever the case is. Like, look, I don't want to take a marijuana case to a jury or even, to a judge. If you come to this education program, you do X, Y, and Z, we'll seek a deferred adjudication, or you know what, we won't even file. But you just need to check these boxes.
But to your point, it checks that box of there's some level of justice going on.
Absolutely. And not only that, but it's subject to individual review. Now, the difference between that and the other is, again, you're looking at that case individually versus you're looking at all marijuana offenses saying, yeah, we're just not doing that.
Right. Or people running into a CVS and filling up their backpacks and deciding not even to stop them, much less prosecute them.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The way to get around that, I think, it would be to not only there is more direct accountability measures that we've already seen filed, but even on the diversion side, if you spell out what a diversion program can look like in statute, then a prosecutor doesn't essentially have to use the amorphous concept of discretion in order to divert somebody away from the system, having that justice actually applied.
So this would satisfy then that feeling of, look, there is somebody somewhere who is able to look at this in a reasonable way and institute some element of justice into the program. We're telling that person, you did a bad thing and there will be repercussions, but we're not necessarily throwing you into hardcore prison and sending you away forever.
Right. And I think some of our friends are too hasty to that too, in the fact that, remember what we talked about earlier, one easy way of putting the sting in a crime or in criminal activity is increasing the penalty. And I'll be the first to say, there are crimes that are woefully undercharged that have a really soft sentencing bracket because, again, we have big sentencing brackets in the state. There are those that need addressed. But that being said, though, we can't just categorically, the closest weapon to hand being, we'll just increase the penalty. That tends to miss a lot of opportunities. And, we're not talking like, you've heard the governor and lieutenant governor say, if you're going to use a gun in a crime, there's going to be a mandatory minimum. Yeah. Now, I think, again, the devil's in the details, and we're going to have to be very, very careful on how those mandatory minimums are constructed, because what we've seen in other states, specifically going far back as the 80s, sometimes mandatory minimums, if they're too onerous, will actually they fall off the charging instrument. You know what I mean? So what the conduct that will be allowed or alleged won't be ones that satisfy that, even if what actually happened satisfies that. So right. you don't want to create basically a gray market for discretion. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You don't want to create that, but you also want to make sure that if somebody uses a gun instrumentally in a crime, absolutely they should be in prison for 10 years. But again, we need to make sure that we're having the discussion specifically both about mens rea and about the instrumentality to make sure that that doesn't
And while we still have 1 minute left, is there somebody who's doing this really well? Is there a state or a locality or a city who's been, really focused on this in the last 5 or 10 years that maybe could be a model?
To be honest with you, from a completely holistic perspective, I think where Texas has been and the trajectory it's going in is good. Again, presupposing that we are going to be having these what's going to be hard, difficult discussions on some of these issues. But, Texas has very few sentence enhancements, almost no mandatory minimums. And so this would be like almost not first of a kind, but this would be relatively unprecedented because we're a large jury sentencing state, right? And so only addressing these specific things rather than making blanket categories, say based on like offense level or very amorphous criteria that can apply to 90 different crimes. I think that's the way to do it. This is rifle shot. It's not scattershot.
You're such a homer. I mean, of course you would say Texas, but that
I
was
didn't say Ohio.
Easy. That is an easy setup though, because Texas has been working on these issues for several decades. So, all right, well, we will close it up there with public safety. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate you listening. We really appreciate you watching. Again, if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear your comments. We'd love to get your feedback and constructive criticism. Again, I'm on Twitter at RealBphil, and Derek's on Twitter at Cohen at TPPF. Thank you for watching. And as always, do good and suffer the consequences.